Hi, good morning. So we will, once the slide begins, we'll shortly make you all go through what will be the scope of the presentation. As Abhishek sir pointed out, we'll be covering only on the basics of how to initiate an arbitration smoothly and until the point where preliminary jurisdictional challenges can be raised before the tribunal. We won't be going beyond that. Shilpa, we can move to the next slide. Yes. So firstly, I'll be touching upon why should we go for arbitration and not any other alternate dispute resolution mechanism. So before going into the different kinds of alternate dispute resolution mechanism, there is statutory protection or provision which allows for ADRS mechanism. In fact, it is encouraged by courts. So Section 89 of CPC has laid down 4 different mechanisms, one of which is arbitration, the other 3 being mediation, conciliation, and the lok adalats which function in district courts and across states. So why not go for mediation or conciliation, which are also ADRS mechanisms which work effectively throughout India, and why opt for arbitration? Now, firstly, mediation is an assisted negotiation mechanism. There are mediation centers attached to district courts, high courts, where people go for mediating their matters. Settlement proposition is drawn, and that has to be referred back to the court, which will finally pass an order based upon the settlement proposition. Conciliation, again, is a mechanism where parties can go for settlement even in the absence of a contract which actually calls out or provides for any conciliation mechanism. That will be governed by Part 3 of the arbitration. And once parties reach a settlement, they draw out a settlement, and accordingly the matter is settled. Now, why do we go for arbitration? And generally, contracts have an arbitration clause over, say, a mediation or a conciliation, although contracts may also have a pre-arbitration negotiation session, which would include probably a mediation or conciliation session. First and foremost, arbitration is something which is binding. The nature of the award is considered equivalent to a court order, and once the award is there, the arbitral award can be enforced before a court of law. And that's the primary reason why parties opt for arbitration over other forms of ADRS. Second, arbitration is time saving. We have statutory stipulations within which the arbitration needs to be completed. Before the 2019 Act, the law was that arbitration has to be completed within first 12 months. Then parties can seek an extension. Mutually, they can extend it for 6 months. If the matter is not completed, then courts will, their application has to be filed before court for further extension for 3 months. So within a span of total 12 plus 6 plus 3, 18 months, the procedure has to, 21 months, the procedure has to be completed, and finally an award has to be there in the hands of the parties. Now, as after the 2019 amendment, there has been a little bit of flexibility on the timeline aspects. Well, in domestic arbitration, there is a stipulated time within which parties need to complete the arbitration proceeding. However, in international commercial arbitration, there is some bit of flexibility. The amendment imposes a sort of responsibility on the parties to ensure that proceedings are completed within 12 months, although it's not a mandate. Now, another important benefit of arbitration is that the arbitration clause can be drafted in a way where expert guidance can be taken in terms of who shall be appointed as an arbitrator. So the dispute in hand, if it is probably a technical matter or it requires sector expertise, then you can choose the arbitrators accordingly. It guarantees flexibility in proceedings in terms of the dates for scheduling dates of hearings, and the pace of the hearing can be effectively managed by the parties along with the arbitrator.
Just coming in here for a bit, for example, an example of adjudication by experts. We are currently engaged in an international commercial arbitration, which concerns a dispute between a broadcaster and an international delivery platform operator. And this is the first time we saw such a clause. The clause specifically says that the arbitrator to be appointed by the LCIA in this case, which is administering the process, will have to be someone who has subject matter expertise in the television broadcasting, in the pay TV broadcasting industry for at least 5 years. So it's as specific as that. So to find, and that's why to zero in on the arbitrator, we finally got a QC who has that kind of experience. But to zero in on the arbitrator with that kind of experience, even in a jurisdiction like the UK, took us some time, and which sort of led to the arbitration process getting pushed by a bit. But I guess the flip side of that is once the arbitration process starts, then a lot of the concepts need not be explained thoroughly. There's a lot of stuff which the arbitrator, because of the fact that they would have that subject matter experience and the industry experience, would need not, we need not labor on those aspects. They are just taken care of pretty much either by way of a short, email or a memorial of whatever sort of thing. Please carry on.
Okay, so proceeding from there, I've covered flexibility of the proceedings, and arbitration is a cost-effective.
Sorry to interrupt you again, Atmaja. Just one thing. So an example of flexibility in proceedings could also be that parties could decide to have a documents-only arbitration, which is very relevant in a situation like we are in today, where because of COVID-19, having hearings is even video conferencing sometimes can be difficult, but arbitration allows you to have a documents-only arbitration and to, in fact, render an award just on the basis of the written submissions of the parties.
Okay. So moving on to the cost-effective aspect. So there is a cap under the Arbitration Conciliation Act under Schedule 4, where there are 3 categories of fees which the arbitrator shall be paid by the parties. So either parties can opt for that mechanism which seals the fees to a particular limit, or parties can go for a per session payment thing, where in that case the arbitration may seem a little costly an affair than a normal suit. However, again, arbitration is a time-bound process, so the cost effectiveness obviously comes in with that aspect. Now, the last important aspect of arbitration is the confidentiality part of the proceedings. So parties, until the 2019 amendment came into place, statutorily there was no mandate for parties or the arbitrator to maintain confidentiality. So what parties would do is they could probably mutually agree on it, or if there would be some dispute, they could file an application under Section 17 and seek an interim relief in terms of having the proceedings kept confidential. Now, with the 2019 amendment, there's a new section which has been inserted, Section 42A, which imposes obligation on the arbitrator, on the parties, as well as the arbitral institution to maintain confidentiality of all the proceedings other than the award, which will be finally rendered by the arbitrator. And that the confidentiality part can be breached only at that point where it's required for enforcement of the award. Moving on to the next aspect of the presentation. Shilpa, we can move on. So before beginning an arbitration proceeding, first and foremost is presence of an arbitration clause or an arbitration agreement. And it's very important how we word the arbitration clause, because quite often if the wording is not clear and it's ambiguous, it can lead to jurisdictional issues, it can lead to preliminary maintainability issues, and to some extent it can actually thwart the entire arbitration proceeding. First principle is the clause should be kept wide and broadly worded so as to take the benefit of including under the umbrella any sort of dispute which may arise from the transaction that's being contemplated pursuant to the contract or the agreement. Now, actually, we are we are part of an arbitration where there was a term sheet signed. Shilpa would be further explaining this aspect of non-binding term sheets or MOUs. So in the term sheet, we had an arbitration clause. However, the transaction took place, there was no documentation to that effect in respect of the transfer which actually took place. So the only saving grace was this broad scope of wording of the arbitration clause, which included any dispute which may come pursuant to the transaction contemplated in the term sheet. So we really relied on that aspect of the arbitration clause to push forward for the entire arbitration for the transaction which had undergone basis upon conduct of the parties, even if we did not have any sort of executed document to that effect. The second aspect is another important aspect is governing law. Parties need to be careful of what will be the governing law, what will be the substantive law that will cover the dispute, if any, which arises in future, and what will be the procedural law that will govern the arbitral proceedings. Now, this will be dependent on the parties concerned, the place where they are inhabiting, where the company is probably registered, or the place of transaction. This may also depend upon whether there are reciprocating territories of which awards can be enforced in India. So depending on the fact.
Karan, just confirm, could you share the revised language with the written language?
So depending on the facts and circumstance, parties should decide the governing law, which will govern the arbitral proceedings, as well as the substantive law, which should be enforced in place. Now, the third aspect will be procedure for appointment of arbitrator.
Okay.
Parties again can opt for an institutional arbitration mechanism, or they can go for an ad hoc arbitration mechanism where they will choose an individual or a sole arbitrator, or they can have a mechanism to appoint, say, 3 arbitrators, so that the arbitration can take place in an ad hoc mechanism. Now, there are benefits which come to place if there's an institutional arbitration clause in terms of expertise which they get in terms of appointment of arbitrators to adjudicate on the specific area of dispute. Institutional arbitral rules are pretty settled and the application thereof are easy. So that is the benefit which comes along with institutional arbitration. Keeping in mind this aspect of institutional arbitration and how it's globally increased so much and it's so much put to use, the 2019 amendment has adopted a sort of model from the Hong Kong Institutional Arbitration Center and the Singapore Institutional Arbitration Center to create a mechanism where all arbitrations in India would in future be governed under an institutional arbitration mechanism. When parties opt for an ad hoc arbitration mechanism, there are certain points where it's very important that parties keep in mind. First, you cannot have a unilateral appointment clause, because there are decisions where the courts have held that unilateral appointment clauses, especially when the party is in a bargaining position and has a better power to bargain and negotiate the clause, will be held as illegal clause and it cannot be enforced. So thereafter, you will have the mechanism where court will finally appoint an arbitrator. And once the slide is over, I'll show a couple of examples of how the clauses, if reworded in a manner, they can actually impinge upon the entire arbitration proceedings. The second last aspect is having a concept of multi-tiered arbitration clause, where you can have, say, a pre-arbitration negotiation or mediation or conciliation, where parties can have their senior management officers or managements or CEOs or people with power involved in the position to settle the dispute, and there can be timelines put to that. If parties are not able to amicably settle the dispute, then they invoke the arbitration clause. Lastly, there can be specific timelines put for invoking the arbitration clause, and that's where a lot of issues, jurisdictional issues with respect to limitation arises. Now, if the contract stipulates, say, once the dispute arises between parties, or once parties are unable to settle amicably, then within 45 days or within 30 days or 15 days, they have to invoke the arbitration clause. And if you skip this arbitration timeline, then it may be very difficult to, invoke the arbitration clause, or this can be a primary jurisdictional issue based on limitation. So I'll just share my screen and show a couple of clauses. First, I will show one clause, and I'd want inputs from all of you as to what is wrong in this clause. Just bear with me for a minute. Is this visible?
Not yet.
Okay, just a minute. I'm actually sharing my screen. Sorry, just 1 minute. Can you see it now? Is the arbitration clause visible?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you guys can just read it once and tell me what you think of the lacuna or the beneficial aspect of this clause. Anyone who wants to fill in for this?
Okay.
Any inputs?
Arbitration and appeal and force. What?
Okay, so giving a background, so this relates to dispute relating to oil companies, and FOSFA 80 is basically it's the Federation of Oil Seeds and Fats Association Limited. So they have their own rules which apply, and quorum rules are also something which are applicable in Malaysia, and that's also Palm Oil Refineries Association, which they have certain set of rules that will govern arbitration. Now, if you see this arbitration clause, it mentions two technical rules that will govern the arbitration. At the same time, it also says arbitration shall be submitted in India. So that aspect is clear. But there's a lot of ambiguity in this clause because it doesn't clarify on what will be the applicable law that the proceedings will be governed by. It doesn't really clarify on how the substantive law of India, whether it would apply or not. Now, when there was a practical problem that we faced when we had to invoke this arbitration clause, because the FOSFA 80 rules and quorum rules both have limitation period in sort of kept in their own rules, whereas Indian Arbitration Act does not specifically have any limitation period. While it states that limitation act of 3 years would apply, beyond that, there's no specific limitation where you need to invoke the arbitration clause or you need to take the dispute for arbitration. So there was, when the arbitration notice was sent to the opposite side, the response which came was FOSFA 80 and quorum rules clearly state that there's a limitation period of X timeline, which had already been surpassed, whereas what we relied upon was that arbitration would be submitted in India. Hence, there's no limitation period as per the Indian laws, and therefore that will hold applicable to our specific case. So this is a classic example of when the drafting is not clear, it can lead to a lot of challenges in terms of initiating the arbitration, because a lot of time can go into clarifying these aspects even before the arbitration actually begins. After this, I will share one more arbitration clause, which is with a bank. It's with SBI. And I'll show, I'd want you guys to point out what is the clause which is problematic in that. Just 1 minute. Okay. Is this visible?
No, Atmaja, we can still see the
I
old
can
clause.
still see the,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, can you guys see it now?
I think it's going to come. Yeah.
Yes, yes, we can.
So you can read point 10, governing law and arbitration.
Any difference? So here, I think the problem would have been unilateral appointment of the arbitrator.
Exactly. So quite often what happens is when you are contracting with a bank or a government agency or government for, say, government contracts, public contracts, there would be such clauses where the power to even mediate pre-arbitration mediation would lie only with the government or with the bank, or there could be a sole power would lie with them to appoint the sole arbitrator. Now, this has been specifically barred by courts, and the latest decision of 2019 in Perkins judgment clearly holds that somebody who is ineligible for being appointed as an arbitrator because of personal interest involved in the matter cannot have powers to appoint the sole arbitrator. So it has to be arbitration being a creation of contract. That flexibility has to be given to the parties to have the choice of arbitrators on board. I will share one more agreement.
Before
yes.
you move on,
Yes.
unilateral appointment, while it has been held as being void, like an agreement which allows for unilateral appointment, what is allowed is providing a panel of arbitrators. So if in this clause, instead of stating, I mean, the clause, if it amended to state that SBI would provide a panel of arbitrators from which the other party could choose the arbitrator of their choice, then that kind of a clause is valid, even though the panel and the choice of arbitrators within that panel is still coming from one party only. The courts have also analyzed in what cases, that how diverse the panel should be and what truly amounts to a choice. So sometimes even a panel of 4 arbitrators has been held to be a wide enough choice given to the other party, but sometimes even 30 arbitrators in a panel has been held to not give an adequate choice to another party to choose, because if out of 30 arbitrators in my panel, 26 are my own employees who are likely to decide in my favor, then that's not really offering a choice to the other party. So there are unilateral appointment because the idea behind unilateral appointments for entities who enter into a lot of arbitrations and a lot of transaction is that it just saves time, which is involved in mutually deciding upon an arbitrator. But it could be worked around by providing a wide choice and a wide panel of arbitrators.
That's correct. So lastly, I'll be showing one more agreement. After that, we'll move on to the presentation.
Just 1 second. Should I hold this for it's just
No,
relevant to the
please.
discussion that we are having. So right now, when we talked about 4 being a good enough choice versus 30, now out of that, even if those 26 are sort of not applicable to be worthy of the panel which has been appointed and the options which are given, you still have those 4 to choose from, right? So in the arbitration clause, it would be important to list down the number of people that you are going to be providing for as an option, or how would it work from a practical aspect?
So the reason that I mentioned those 2 numbers is that you are right. You should ideally specify what the number should be in your panel, and also what kind of an arbitrator cannot be a part of the panel at all. So if I am providing you with a panel of 30 arbitrators, 26 are my employees, and the remaining 4 have some or the other relation to me, or have somehow compromised their impartiality in other ways, could still leave you with not really any option, or probably like 1 or 2 names out of that entire list, which is not truly a choice. Because let's say that the other 4 arbitrators are all impartial, but none of them have any domain expertise, or that they don't fulfill the requirements of who you would want to be arbitrating your dispute. And I'm not really giving you an option in that sense. So you are right. The clause should ideally, if you are providing for unilateral appointment by way of providing a panel of arbitrators, you should ideally have guidelines which dictate who can be included in that panel.
Okay.
I think just adding to that bit, while we have a portion of the presentation dedicated to who cannot be appointed as an arbitrator, since we're discussing now, I'll just give a short point on this. The Act provides for grounds of challenge to appointment of arbitrator under Section 12. And clearly, post the 2015 amendments, there have been 3 schedules included to the Act, 5, 6, and 7, where the impartiality, or independence or transparency of the process and the relationship of the arbitrator with either of the parties can be questioned. So to stay on a safe side, unilateral appointment should be avoided. But there are situations where you have, say, a bank which enters into contract on a daily basis. Now, for them to give that sort of benefit of flexibility to every customer that you
is going to be problematic.
It's going to be problematic. But they have to ensure that the panelists that they have, they need to keep neutral people in mind, so that this, invoking the Section 12 bar is not brought in question, because that will stall the entire proceeding, and courts may weigh in favor of, say, clients or banking customers if they say probably a loan or housing loan agreement from a consumer perspective point of view.
Right.
They may weigh in their favor to hold that the arbitration clause is invalid, or they may appoint arbitrators. So the entire aspect has to be very carefully considered before you have such unilateral appointment clauses.
Okay. And just another quick question. When we're talking about severability of, severability of this, a severability clause in an agreement, so while appointment of a unilateral arbitrator may be void, there are other provisions which would have, which would still continue to be valid, or the entire agreement, because of one, one appointment of the arbitrator, be considered as void.
So it won't be considered as void. What would happen is then the court will
be an appointment through the court.
Yes, correct. Okay. There'll be an appointment through the court.
Okay, got it.
Are there any further questions on this? If not, then I'll show the last agreement, which basically is, so this is fairly detailed. The reason why I'm showing this agreement is this has a pre-arbitration notice and dispute settlement clause in place. So it will give an idea of how...
actually, the agreement that Abhishek sir was referring to in the beginning.
So this clause 14, basically dispute clause that has a notice requirement that parties have to give notice. And further, when you move on to 15, when I scroll on, you'll see how that notice plays an important role even prior to beginning the arbitration proceeding. Please let me know when I should scroll on.
You can scroll, I guess.
Okay. So all the aspects that we discussed in under the heading how to have the perfect arbitration clause to some extent is covered in this agreement. And a very important aspect is when you have a pre-arbitration negotiation point included specifically in the clause, then you have to invoke that even before going into arbitration. Otherwise, if you directly go into arbitration, that can be a challenge to the arbitration proceedings. Any questions?
Atmaja, can you just scroll up? I wanted to understand the last clause of the 14th clause.
So you want me to explain that?
Yeah, so when we're talking about they can seek urgent interim relief, how would that pan out from a practical aspect?
I'll talk from Indian perspective. So
Yeah.
if you have this agreement in the Indian setup, then you have something under Section 9 of the Arbitration Act, which talks about interim reliefs, which can be claimed either before, after, or during the arbitration. So even before invoking, say, you want to restrain the other party from sale of shares or sale of property, then you can invoke that.
The English laws are pretty similar with respect to arbitration.
Maybe Shilpa can answer on this. Shilpa?
Yes. On this aspect, any urgent interim relief can be sought even while the parties are seeking to amicably resolve the dispute.
Okay.
So, but just one thing that I'd like to point out in clause 14, if you can see, as well drafted as it is, it states that each party shall notify the other party of any dispute arising out of or in connection with this agreement. Now, the slight ambiguity that is left out by the use of the word notify without specifying that what form or what manner this notification has to be in did create a little bit of a hurdle for us. Obviously, it's an
notice clause take care of that.
It does and it doesn't, but I mean, it's subject of interpretation then, because notification doesn't necessarily have to be in writing. A notice has to be in writing. So in the event you want for everything to be in writing and to have like a paper trail of everything, it's also important that even in your pre-arbitral dispute mechanism, you specify exactly what form or manner of notification you want.
So if we have a any correspondence would include a notification, right? I mean, I don't know the notice clause, but I'm just trying to understand what all.
Yes. Any correspondence would include a notification, but I can also go beyond that and say that any oral correspondence will also include a notification.
I think the problem that may arise here is whether that notification has to be specifically raising this red flag with respect to the dispute, or that is, so you are having a normal correspondence with the opposite side, and there you, at the end, you just state that, okay, there's some dispute which may arise or which we need to settle. So that's where the problem may come in place.
Okay.
No, so
my question is actually just arising from the fact as to when we need to advise our clients with respect to how correspondence should be made with respect to a transaction.
So as is in as the case in a lot of agreements, this agreement also has a clause which says that any notices have to be in writing.
Exactly. Boilerplate clause, and nobody
pays
attention
but it would be helpful just from the from the purview of this dispute if you clarify in that clause that every notice, including the notification in, let's say, clause 14, has to be in writing.
Any notification with respect to this agreement? Because the thing is that when we are drafting, there are a lot of clauses which need to be notified, or then there needs to be written an approval or a communication or intimation. So I thought
that works. So that works. Any way in whatever clause you're incorporating to make this understanding clear, that works. It's just that in this agreement, while the use of the word in the notice clause was notice, over here it just says notify. And I understand that an argument can be made that if every notice has to be in writing, then this must also be in writing. But let's say that okay, it has to be a notice in writing, but then does it have to be a letter notice or like an email that I exchange, or just, let's say, text messaging between two parties, which is happening for official official messages also you are exchanging through text messaging. Does that also constitute, if it's clear enough? So you should ideally set it out clearly, because it's very important to ensure any future hurdles in your remove those hurdles in your pre-arbitral mechanism.
Okay.
So if there are no further questions on this aspect, then we'll move on.
Just adding to the discussion that you guys are having right now, you can argue both ways because of the fact that 14.1 uses the word notify and not notice. Therefore, such notification need not necessarily be in writing. So, of course, it always then becomes a question of evidence as to whether or not that proper notification was given. Especially because 13, just move up a little.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
13 talks about notices, and unless otherwise provided, any notices, requests, consent, waivers, or demands or other communications required or given under this agreement shall be in the English language and shall be effective only if in writing and shall be deemed to be effectively given, right? Now, the point is that you are, by the notification that is set out in 14.1.
Yeah.
A, is it a notice of a dispute under 14.1 is the question.
Isn't it a communication required under the agreement?
Is it a communication required under the agreement in term? Yeah, well, arguable, undoubtedly arguable, and that's what the other side's argument was also when in our case the client had not given a notification. I mean, the notification was given in writing was also impacted by the without prejudice rules. The other side argued that if you take out that notice in writing, which is protected by the without prejudice rule, then there is no notification of dispute at all.
Okay. So then it's more of a without prejudice thing which came up rather than it being in a written format.
No. So I'm saying they said that once you take that out, because that without prejudice notice is given in writing, of course.
Correct.
But because it is protected by without prejudice, there is no other notification in writing that has been sent out.
Okay.
Whereas there is a clear exchange of communication talking about a phone call that took place between the parties at a point in time on which this dispute was discussed. So the arbitrator came to the conclusion that we satisfied the notification requirement not only by concluding that the without prejudice documentation was not really protected under without prejudice rule because of the fact that it did not say anything that altered any party's position, and it was a pure notification of dispute, and merely because it had the legend without prejudice at the top does not necessarily mean that it was supposed to be without prejudice. But he independently also came to the conclusion that the email correspondences which the parties were exchanging prior to that notice being sent demonstrated that there was a semblance of a dispute, and that read with the admission that there was a telephone communication between the parties relating to the dispute, that would be sufficient. So the reason why we perhaps got away with the fact that the notification may not have been in writing, and I'm talking dehorse the without prejudice communication, was because of the fact that purely on equity, we were better off compared to the other side. So therefore he read this in conjunction with the earlier email communications which were not regarding the notification of dispute, read the oral notification of dispute to read, to say that you've satisfied us.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, no doubt about the fact that when you're advising, if I were to advise the client, when I looked at this agreement as to what process needs to be followed, I would say, please send a notice in writing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, I will just proceed with the next slide. Shilpa, you can share.
Can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
So once there is a arbitration clause in place, what would happen next is not ideally, but what happens is that there is a dispute. And once that there is a dispute, how would you go about adjudicating it is at the outset sending a notice of arbitration. It has been debated under Indian law for the longest time as to what is the relevance of this notice of arbitration that is set out in section 21. I'll just quickly share the screen and show the text of section 21. Yes, so section 21 states, unless otherwise agreed by the parties, the arbitral proceedings in respect of a particular dispute commence on the date on which a request for that dispute to be referred to arbitration is received by the respondent. So now one thing is clear is that the relevance of a notice of arbitration is very important when it comes to determining the date of commencement and mainly to determine when such a dispute becomes barred by limitation. But that was the position in India up until 2017. Earlier, the judgment which sort of covered this aspect most exhaustively was the Supreme Court's judgment in State of Goa versus Praveen Enterprises. What the Supreme Court analyzed over there was that there can be several cases where claims are made or raised without any notice of arbitration being sent. For instance, in the case of a cross claim, or in the case where pleadings are amended at a later stage to add a claim to your statement of claim. And noting that, what the Supreme Court held is that the only relevance of a arbitration notice is that it determines when your limitation clock starts to run. However, the Delhi High Court in the decision in Alupro Building Systems in 2017 has expanded the scope and purpose of a notice of arbitration beyond what was stated by the Supreme Court in State of Goa versus Praveen Enterprises. What the court noted was that there are situations under the arbitration and conciliation agreement which which provide for parties to determine their own procedure as to how to go about the arbitration. And there are arbitral clauses which exhaustively set out a procedure for arbitration. Without a notice of arbitration being sent, you cannot possibly determine whether these pre-arbitral clauses are satisfied. The court also noted that the consent, that it's very important in order to decide whether you want to approach the court in a Section 11 application, that you prove that the other side has not consented to the arbitrator that you have proposed or is not following the procedure that you've set out. And this cannot be seen, their consent or lack thereof cannot be seen in the absence of a notice of arbitration. Thirdly, what the court noted is that it's very important as a respondent to know what is the claim against me. Once I know that there is a claim against me and know the exact contours of that claim against me, I can probably reach out, respond, and accept accept my liability either partly or wholly, resultantly not even necessarily needing for the dispute to proceed to adjudication. And lastly, like Atmaja had described, there could be possibilities that you have multi-tiered arbitration clauses which have pre-arbitral dispute mechanisms laid out, and without a notice of arbitration being sent out, it's impossible to determine whether a clause like that has been complied with. So, which is why, while noting all of these purposes, what the Delhi High Court did is that it detailed what are the necessary elements of a notice of arbitration and stated that a notice of arbitration should set out the scope of the dispute and which of those disputes remain unsolved. It should set out exactly what the claim of each side is, and if there already exists an intimation of a counterclaim, then it should set that out as well. It should set out exactly when your claim arose so as to determine any questions of limitation. And ultimately, you should very clearly set out the choice of arbitrator and how it is in accordance with your arbitration agreement. So these are the requirements and the contents of notice as set out by the Delhi High Court in Alupro Building Systems. As I just said, though the Delhi High Court has stated that your claim has to be clearly set out, they haven't necessarily stated that you have to specify who the parties to the arbitration will be at the stage of notice itself. However, it can be, when you say that your claim has to be set out, that can be construed to mean that who will be the claimants and who will be the respondent in your action should ideally also be set out. This becomes very relevant in multi-party arbitrations where you have more than one claimant or more than one respondent, and particularly becomes very, very relevant when you're trying to array non-signatories to an arbitral proceedings. We'll explore more of what are the principles that govern arraignment of non-signatories to an arbitration. But in the event your arbitral agreement or your dispute calls for arraignment of non-signatories to your arbitral proceedings, you should ideally mark a copy of the notice to such non-signatories as well. Or if they are going to be claimants, then possibly a power of attorney should be executed by all of them in favor of one claimant who authorizes the lawyer, or all of them authorizing the lawyer who sends out the notice is advisable, just to avoid any arbitrability questions being raised on that account. One of the most important things that has to be satisfied even before you send out your notice of arbitration is the satisfaction of pre-arbitral mechanisms. As we've already discussed, there can be pre-arbitral mechanisms which provide for arbitration or provide for conciliation or just amicable discussions between parties, and they set out a timeline also for such discussions. In India, the position has been fairly clear. The Supreme Court has time and time again upheld such clauses to be mandatory and to be and to be necessary to be complied with before any appointment can be made. What is interesting is that recently Justice Ranjan Gogoi, in the decision in Demerara Distilleries, actually carved out an exception to this settled rule, where he noted that though there was a pre-arbitral mechanism, it wasn't necessary to be followed because the correspondence that had been exchanged between the parties indicated that resorting to this pre-arbitral mechanism would just be ineffective and would not have any impact. The situation had already reached a pretty unresolvable point, and there was no purpose to this arbitral mechanism being resorted to. So this exception that has been carved out, it's debatable whether it's in line with the generally recommended position that courts should not try to interfere in arbitration proceedings, and especially do not try to interfere with the intention of the parties as has been set out in the agreement. So I don't know how correct this judgment is, but this exception has been set out recently. The other exception that has been set out in a recent judgment in March 2019 passed by Justice Nariman, particularly applicable for contracts with government entities or with PSUs, is where a arbitral clause sets out a precondition. In this particular case, there was a precondition that there had to be a deposit of 10% of the claimed amount prior to sending a notice of arbitration, and this was held to be ineffective and make the entire proceeding expensive, and it was also held to be arbitrary. And to that extent, even though it was an agreed pre-arbitral mechanism, it was held to not be binding on the parties. The only confusion that has been created in the bindingness of a pre-arbitral clause is by the Delhi High Court. There are several decisions of the Delhi High Court which hold pre-arbitral mechanism clause to just be directory and not mandatory. But in light of the fact that the Supreme Court has held a position that's to the contrary, unless your appointment, your Section 11 is going to be filed before the Delhi High Court, it's likely that the courts are going to decide in favor of the pre-arbitral mechanism and not go ahead and appoint an arbitrator unless it has been satisfied. Any questions?
Just to add to that multi-party arbitration thing. So when you have respondents, hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Atmaja.
When you have respondents which are probably part of the same group company, it's important that individually you have to serve notices on each of those group companies and not just serve on, say, the parent entity and not on the subsidiaries, because that will not satisfy the notice requirement. Shilpa, you can move on if there are no questions.
Are there any questions?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
I have a question regarding notice of arbitration.
Yes.
In circumstance that I do not respond to the notice of arbitration and it only goes to Section 11 for appointment, and at that point I raise a question regarding my counterclaim to the arbitration, and so will the High Court judgment bar in that? The recent High Court judgment that we were discussing?
I'm sorry, Sanya, I don't understand your question. So you're saying that if you don't get an opportunity to raise your counterclaim in response to a notice of arbitration, whether you can do that before a Section 11 court?
So basically, you said the High Court judgment states that you need to set out your claim and counterclaim and parties and all details of the arbitration.
No, so as a claimant, my responsibility is only to set out my claim. But if I am aware of a counterclaim that has already been notified by the other side to me by probably an earlier email or probably during the pre-arbitral discussions, then it's relevant to set that out as well. But it's not necessary.
Can I, being the claimant, add on to my claims after after the notice is sent out? At a later stage, maybe, while filing the statement of claim?
So there is a provision, that's Section 23, that allows you to amend your statement of claim and possibly add an additional claim. But like in civil suits, it cannot be that you were aware that you were aware of all the facts that give rise to that claim and you didn't raise it at the appropriate time. You have to satisfy that you were not that there are some new circumstances that have arisen which give rise to your new claim, and then add that claim definitely. But it can't be an afterthought. So in that sense, it becomes even more relevant that your Section 21 notice has to set out your entire claim as it exists in that moment. Probably not the particulars of it, but the basis of it definitely.
All right, but and I mean, the idea is earlier the notice to an arbitration was merely just an intimation, like a knock on your door, like I want to initiate the arbitration and let's resolve our disputes in a certain way. After this High Court judgment, I think a lot of dynamics to that has changed, and the necessity of writing a proper notice has come into play.
Yes. So what the High Court has actually done is that it's put responsibility on the shoulders of the claimant to not just notify the respondent that I have a dispute against you that I'm going to take to court or that I want to adjudicate, but also inform the respondent what exactly my claim arising out of that dispute is going to be. Because it's possible, like I said, that a part of it is admitted by the other side, and then the process of adjudication is shortened by that much time.
Okay.
It's not necessary that a part of that part of your claim is admitted just because it's a true claim, but it's also there are commercial interests involved in not unnecessarily litigating, right? So if I set out my claim succinctly, and if there is a responsibility on me to set out my claim completely and clearly at the first stage itself, then it's possible for the respondent to take a call right then and there to not take it to litigation and to, despite what the true position about their liability may be, just to settle it.
Okay. Why I'm particularly asking this is because one of our parties the opposite party had a claim. They first sent out a notice and raised a claim of 6 crores. Then later on, there was a pre-arbitration proceedings where they had to conduct a proper mediation process, and there they write the claim has to be 4 lakhs, and then they come for appointment of arbitration, and then they write the claim to be 2 crores. So the idea is when the party itself is writing notices and filing other Section 11 or proper mediation proceedings, pleading, they are not really certain at that stage. The actual, I mean, they should be certain.
Right. So as a respondent, you can raise that in your defense. You can state that how am I expected to defend myself when their claim keeps changing? How do I defend my liability or lack thereof to pay this amount if they are not certain, if the claimant is not certain as to what the amount is? And this judgment of the Delhi High Court can definitely come to your rescue there because it places the onus of that entirely on the claimant.
Right. Will that be good ground for me at the time of Section 11 to say that this arbitration doesn't lie, because as a respondent to this, because the claimant is not certain about its own claim?
Yes, because the proper notice of arbitration is essential to proceed to appointment.
But I don't think that can be a ground for challenge at Section 11 stage. That will be a preliminary jurisdictional challenge which you'll have to raise before the tribunal.
But how is that a jurisdictional challenge? It goes as to the very essence of whether an appointment can be made. Because if we are saying that if you don't follow a pre-arbitral mechanism, then an appointment can't be made, then if your notice doesn't set out the true elements of what a notice is supposed to set out, can you proceed to appointment?
That's correct, but what a Section 11 court will see whether there's an arbitration agreement or not. Beyond that, they are not supposed to see whether there's a claim or there's a validity of the claim or not. That's something which the tribunal will decide thereafter.
No, you're absolutely correct on that account. But if I can prima facie show that there is no clarity as to what the claim is, it changes on each notification that I'm being sent. So that would actually lead to the fact that the notice of the Section 21 requirement has not been complied with. I'm not saying that it will bar the court from making the appointment, but it will definitely, the court is authorized to direct the claimant to send an appropriate notice, right? Prior to then wanting to initiate.
Because that goes to the very root of whether there is a valid dispute or not. Like if the party.
So if you see, there are two angles to it. First, if there was a pre-arbitration mediation required or not, if that is not satisfied, of course, Section 11 court will send it back. But if there's a dispute with respect to validity of the claim, whether there's a valid dispute or not, that is something Section 11 court will not decide upon. That's it's very clear that court will just see whether there's an arbitration agreement. Whether validity of the claim comes into question, that is something you have to take it to the tribunal or the arbitrator.
So, I mean, there is no clarity on what the Section 11 court would do, but Allupro was a Section 34 case, and over there, the Delhi High Court held that the lack of a proper notice goes to the very root of the arbitration and will render the award null and void. So, I guess if there are there probably may now be cases wherein the Section 11 court may have the chance to deal with this, but what Atmaja is saying also makes sense. If this is something that goes to the validity of a claim, if that argument is made, then a Section 11 court will not go into this question.
All right. I understand now. Thank you.
Okay. If there are no more questions on notice of arbitration, then we'll proceed to the next segment, which is basically when can a court intervene prior to commencement of arbitration. Now, prior to 2015 Amendment Act, there was a lot of confusion in the judicial domain as to whether the powers of court would be in the nature of administrative, judicial function. What would be the extent when a court can intervene in the process of arbitration, and what would be exactly the umbrella within which the court, Section 11 court, will act when there is any sort of arbitration petition brought on board. So what courts had decided until the 2015 Amendment Act was there would be three categories of cases. First category where only the court can decide. The second category would be something intermingling between the jurisdiction and the appointment aspect and primary preliminary bits of merits of the case. The last aspect is pure merits, where court cannot intervene and only the tribunal can decide. Now, first aspect is where courts can only intervene. That's solely in the domain of appointment of arbitrator. It was very clear that while an arbitrator is being appointed and the question is raised in relation thereto, then the sole powers lie with the court, and the court can intervene, and court only has the power to decide. The second aspect, where we raise questions on validity of the agreement, validity of the dispute or the claim amount, as Sania just pointed out, there was a lot of ambiguity in that segment because courts across had an opinion that High Court or Supreme Court had the power to intervene at that point in time. So what 2015 amendment brought into place is it curtailed first the power of judicial intervention by limiting it only to 3 provisions. Section 8, which is basically a reference of a suit or a dispute to arbitration from court. Section 9, where you can claim interim reliefs either prior to the arbitration proceeding or during or after the proceeding, but prior to stage of enforcement of the award, and Section 11. Now, Section 11(6)(a) particularly has limited the scope of the court to see whether there's existence of agreement only, which we'll deal later when we go into Section 11. So first segment, even prior to beginning the arbitration proceeding, where the court can intervene is when you need urgent reliefs or in the nature of interim relief. Now, Section 9 has given broad powers to court, and it has laid down very categorically that interim reliefs can be sought in 3 stages under Section 9: before beginning the proceeding, during the proceeding, and after the proceeding, but before enforcing the final award. When can parties go and seek interim reliefs? Of course, a claimant or any party who thinks that there is a possibility where the right will be impinged later, say, which may be because of sale of property in question or sale of shares, or where somebody wants appointment of a receiver to evaluate the situation, or preservation of property is required, or a party wants an appointment of guardian. In these situations, even before invoking the arbitration, parties can file a Section 9 petition. Jurisdiction which will lie with the court is something will be decided depending on definition of court in the Act. Basically, if it's a domestic arbitration situation, then the court with the original jurisdiction, whether district court or high court, will have the power to deal with the Section 9 petition. And if it's an international commercial arbitration that we're looking at, then high court alone will have the power to deal with a Section 9 petition. Now, when there's a Section 9 petition brought into court, there are certain aspects which the party needs to keep in mind. First, you need to immediately send out a Section 21 notice. There is a timeline of 90 days put on the party when you have to invoke the dispute, the arbitration clause, and give a notice of the dispute in question. Now, powers of the court, as I said, are very wide. It can appoint a guardian. It can appoint someone to evaluate the situation in terms of the receiver or for preservation of property. It can also pass orders against third parties who are not related to the arbitration. Once a Section 9 court passes an order, simultaneously, of course, the party who is taking the dispute to court has to send a Section 21 notice informing the respondent about the dispute. And at the same time, this order will be considered as a Section 17 order. It will transform to a Section 17 interim relief order, and thereafter the tribunal will take the due course and consider it. There's one aspect of Section 9 which needs to be discussed, which is basically after commencement of the arbitration, can courts intervene when there's already a tribunal in existence? Now, prior to 2015 amendment, there was again a lot of ambiguity in this segment. The parties would go and file Section 9 petitions before court without even attempting to file a Section 17 application, which also grants similar powers to an arbitral tribunal. The amendment for Section 9, the 2015 amendment has made it clear, and there are certain decisions on this aspect which have made it very clear that a Section 9 court will not entertain any sort of petition after the arbitration commences, and there is only one circumstance where the arbitral tribunal is not in a position to decide, or where the arbitral tribunal, or basically there are circumstances which cannot help the parties to get a sort of relief from Section 17 court. Only then they would go to a Section 9 court and seek relief. For example, if an arbitrator is recusing himself from the role of the arbitrator, that's a typical situation where a Section 17 will not provide any relief, and parties will have to approach a Section 9 court and seek interim reliefs in between the arbitration. Any questions on this aspect?
Just to add a little bit over here, the reason that pre-2015 most parties went to the court under Section 9 as opposed to filing an application under Section 17 before the arbitral tribunal, even after such a tribunal was constituted, is primarily because the scope of the interim powers granted to an arbitral tribunal prior to 2015 was limited, and the kind of orders that could be passed was much more narrower in scope than Section 9. What the 2015 amendment did is that it brought the Section 17 powers available to an arbitral tribunal on par with what is available to a court under Section 9. And that is just so that, you know, the intervention of courts in arbitration is reduced, and that parties are increasingly encouraged to go to a court under Section 17. To an arbitral tribunal under Section 17.
In fact, the Section 17 court also can pass interim orders against third parties. It was earlier not something acceptable prior to the 2015 amendment. Shilpa, we can move to the next slide.
Hi, can you highlight the judgment which says that the Section 17 court can pass, under Section 17 arbitral tribunal can pass orders against third parties?
So there are decisions of the Bombay High Court. If I'm not wrong, there's a decision by the name of Nimbus Enterprises, where the decision dates back to, I think, 2016 or 17, where the court has stated that powers of a tribunal under 17 and powers under Section 9 are similar in nature, and there can be orders passed against third parties. Maybe you can refer to that decision. And there are also subsequent decisions relying on Nimbus. I can't remember exactly. There's a Supreme Court decision also to that effect. I'll share the name of the decision.
But in any event, Sanya, it's also an understanding that's derived from a lot of these decisions, which there are innumerable decisions which say that the powers of Section 9 of a court under Section 9 are at par with those available to an arbitral tribunal under Section 17 after the 2015 amendment has been brought into place. So and there are also many judgments which say that Section 9 courts have the power to pass an order against a third party. So going from there, it's also an interpretation. I think Nimbus, like Atmaja said, is also specifically on that point, but the interpretation that can be drawn is also that if the power is available to a Section 9 court to pass an order against a third party, and if the same powers are available to both an arbitral tribunal and a Section 9 court, then resultantly a arbitral tribunal under Section 17 can also pass an order against a third party.
But the issue is, I understand that only the parties actually to the arbitral proceedings submit to the jurisdiction of the arbitrator, and not the third parties. How can you make an order by an arbitrator who doesn't have a jurisdiction on you being a third party, can pass an order for directing your performance?
You are absolutely right. But if you read Section 17, and I mean, if you read Section 9 and Section 17, there are already interim powers available to both the court as well as the arbitral tribunal to, let's say, appoint a receiver or appoint a guardian in respect of a property. Those that property could the appointment of a receiver or the appointment of a guardian resultantly, like, necessarily will also affect third parties. So when you are giving a court or an arbitral tribunal the power to pass orders which will affect third parties, it's why is it so much out of the question to sometimes, when those third parties, just particularly with respect to that question involved in that interim relief, are already going to be affected by that order, to also make the order binding on them.
I think to add there, say it's not about a third party or a non-signatory who's not involved in the arbitration giving into the jurisdiction of the arbitration. Rightly pointed out by Shilpa, it's any order which will have an effect on the third party. Say I am a shareholder and who's not concerned to the arbitration which the company is involved in. But if the company sells the share or I sell the share, if I am a major shareholder, that will have an impact on the current dispute. Then the tribunal has powers to restrain me from selling shares until the time the actual dispute is adjudicated upon. So these are the situations where not necessarily the third party has to come on board for the arbitration, but the actions of third party will have an impact on the arbitration, and that's why the tribunal has wide powers to pass interim orders against the third parties.
So are you trying to say that there is no purpose of using a Section 9 while the arbitration proceedings are on, and it's only Section 17 that I should address?
Ideally, reading of the provision provides us with this solution, but there are always respondents who raise these issues. Maintainability of Section 17 application is always raised by respondents, saying that there cannot be any sort of claim against a third party who is not related to the dispute. So what parties still keep on doing is they file a Section 9 petition claiming the same reliefs that they would claim under a Section 17 court, and courts can then refer it back. Say if on the first date of hearing, like we have faced the situation, we file a Section 9 petition just to overcome this sort of dispute with the respondent would raise, and we had anticipated that they would raise this. So the matter was heard on the first day itself. They gave into the jurisdiction of the tribunal. They said that we will go back to the tribunal. Of course, they had other concerns of the matter not spilling into public, and they wanted confidentiality to be maintained. But they said that we are okay with the unrelated party to be even considered there, and therefore the matter was sent back to the tribunal. So.
Sanya, the problem is that though there are several high court decisions on this point, the situation regarding whether third party would be bound by a Section 17 order is not well settled. So that honestly is one of the reasons why you would go to a court under Section 9 and not directly to the arbitral tribunal under Section 17. Just because the position is not settled yet. There are high court decisions, but they are not binding on each other.
Right. Thank you.
Should we proceed to the next slide?
Yes. So under the Arbitration Act, once you have complied with the requirements of a notice and once you have complied with the requirements under any pre-arbitral mechanism that you may have, the matter can proceed to be referred to arbitration. Now, the 2015 amendment to the Arbitration and Conciliation Act has changed the structure of the arbitration proceedings in India, because what it focuses on is a lack of intervention by the court at every stage. So there are only two situations envisaged beyond the interim relief that Atmaja mentioned. There are only two other situations envisaged in which during the proceedings or like prior to commencement of arbitration proceedings, the court will intervene or have any say in the arbitral process, which is reference of disputes to arbitration. The first section that I'm going to talk about is Section 8, which is in a reference of dispute to arbitration in an ongoing civil or commercial dispute. What Section 8 does is that it directs a court to compulsorily refer a dispute to arbitration if the subject matter of the dispute has an arbitration agreement. This is not discretionary in nature. The requirement is compulsory, and all that the court has to see before directing or before referring the dispute to arbitration are 5 key factors. Number 1, the court has to see whether there is an arbitration agreement. Once it determines that there is actually an arbitration agreement involved, it has to determine whether all the parties that are parties to the suit are parties to that arbitration agreement as well. The third is whether the subject matter of the dispute is the same as the subject matter of the arbitration agreement. The fourth thing that the court has to see is whether the party who is seeking for the dispute to be referred to arbitration has already made its first statement on the substance of the dispute. This is very interesting because there are many decisions on what constitutes first statement of the subject of the dispute. The idea is that it shouldn't be that you allow a civil proceeding to go on for 1 or 2 years or even 3 years and then come and say that, oh, actually this should be referred to arbitration, because the whole point of something, the whole point of arbitral proceedings is that they're time bound and they're intended to save the time of both the parties. So once you've submitted to the jurisdiction of a civil forum, can you really come and state that, oh, we had a alternate dispute mechanism that I would want the dispute to be adjudicated as per that mechanism. So which is where it becomes very relevant to identify what constitutes first statement on the substance of the dispute. Ideally, it is before you would file your written statement in any civil suit, but what the court has also considered in certain cases is that if it is a case of a summary suit being filed against you, in that case, whether the application for leave to defend would constitute your first statement on the substance of the dispute. And what the court has held is that no, because in your application for leave to defend, just 1 moment, please. Hello, I'm extremely sorry. I think I was having some internet difficulties and I logged out. I'll just share my screen again. Yes, so the court had held that an application for leave to defend will amount to your first statement on substance of the dispute, and if in that case you do not raise the question of you do not raise the issue of the arbitration agreement between parties and do not file a Section 8 application at that stage, then you will be barred from that issue further at any other stage. The last thing that Section 8 court has to see is if the subject matter of the suit is capable of adjudication or is arbitrable for that matter. They're not going to go into detail into this. I think Atmaja will be dealing with arbitrability a little more later, so I am not going to expound on this at the moment. But what the court will see is that whether the well-defined exceptions of arbitrability are clear, prima facie available in that case. And in the event the case involves issues of arbitrability of the subject matter of the dispute, then in that case, the matter will not be referred to arbitration. In the event that a part of the subject matter or a part of the cause of action is such that that is arbitrable and the remaining is not, even then, the matter may not be referred to arbitration because of the principle that bifurcation of a cause of action is just simply not allowed. You will not bifurcate a suit into arbitrable portion and non-arbitrable portion. So in the event a part of it is arbitrable, you will still proceed to try it in a civil court. Any questions?
Just adding there, this is the only segment or case where an arbitration clause can be rendered nullity. Basically, if you file a Section 11 petition before court and you want, say, third parties who are not related or who are non-signatories to be arraigned, and if they are severely disputing to their arraignment to the arbitration proceedings, then what a court ideally would do is send all the parties to a suit, and that's following the ruling of the Supreme Court in Sukanya Holdings, where they state that, basically, as rightly pointed by Shilpa, you cannot divide the same dispute into a part of which will go to a suit and a part of which will go to arbitration, because there may be difficult situations which arise if there are conflicting decisions rendered by the two forums. So at that specific instance, even there is one arbitration clause between, say, party X and Y, all the parties X, Y, Z have to compulsorily go into a suit, and there cannot be an arbitration.
So the one last thing that I wanted to point out in Section 8 is that Section 8, a Section 8 application can be made by the person who has the claim or anybody who is claiming through or under such a person who is a party to the arbitration agreement. So in that sense, it's quite a wide power that's wide right that is given. In fact, it just doesn't have to be only a party to the agreement. If I'm a beneficiary, I can still file a Section 8 application and seek a reference of the dispute to arbitration. Also, a Section 8 court, just like a Section 11 court, which I will go into, which I think Atmaja is going to cover later, is only empowered to see whether there is existence of an arbitration agreement and not go beyond that. Interestingly, recently the Delhi High Court, in a decision passed in February 2020, has in fact given a limitation to the amount of time before which you have to file a Section 8 application. What the Delhi High Court has held that in any commercial suit, the period of limitation that is applicable for filing of a written statement before a commercial court is the same amount of limitation period that would be application for filing a Section 8 application. So as per the Delhi High Court's dictum, now a Section 8 application has to necessarily be filed within 120 days of notice being issued in a commercial suit. This is only right now applicable for commercial suits and only obviously has persuasive value in courts other than the Delhi High Court. But it's a very interesting law that has been evolved by the Delhi High Court recently. Moving on to Section 11, which governs primarily the appointment of an arbitrator in suits which right after sending of your Section 21 notice. Like we had said earlier, parties are given full freedom within their arbitration clause to set out a procedure for appointment of an arbitrator. That may involve, like a couple of the clauses that we showed, it may involve parties first discussing amongst themselves. It may set out exactly the qualifications of who the arbitrator has to be. In certain cases, there may be multi-arbitrator tribunals where both parties have to suggest one arbitrator, and then both of those arbitrators have to appoint a third arbitrator. So in the event that if I send out my Section 21 notice and there is no response to the arbitrator that I have appointed, there's no consent to the arbitrator that I have suggested for appointment, or the other party objects to the fact that I have not followed the procedure for appointment as set out under our arbitration agreement, I can proceed to file an application under Section 11(5) or Section 11(6) of the Arbitration Act. 11(5) mostly governs cases where I have invoked the arbitration clause and the other party has not consented to the arbitrator that I seek to appoint, and 11(6) covers situations where there is allegation of the procedure not being duly followed. The jurisdiction for a Section 11 application differs for an international commercial arbitration and a domestic arbitration. Domestic arbitration, prior to the 2019 amendment, a high court of the respective state which had jurisdiction was the high court, was the judicial authority who had the power to appoint an arbitrator. And in the case of an international commercial arbitration, it was the Supreme Court who had the power to appoint arbitrator under Section 11. However, because of the 2019 amendment, these powers have now been transferred to an arbitral institution that will be designated by the Supreme Court and the High Court respectively in the case of international commercial arbitration or domestic arbitration. Atmaja will expound on this a little bit more later. So, like I had said earlier, the powers of a court under Section 11 to appoint an arbitrator are limited to seeing whether there is whether an arbitration agreement actually exists. Earlier, prior to the 2015 amendment, there was lack of agreement, but there was actually a lot of back and forth between the Supreme Court itself as to whether the authority, whether the power that is being exercised under Section 11 is a judicial power or an administrative power. The problem that comes in if the power under Section 11 is exercised as a judicial power is that then it renders the Section 11 award open to appeal, and also it allows for evidence to be led on certain matters, which does not really come through in the whole timeliness aspect and of an arbitration and the whole objective that is trying to be achieved here. So the 2015 amendment rightfully then what it did is that it inserted Section 11(6)(a) to Section 11 and limited the scope of the exercise of the power under Section 11 to only seeing the existence of an arbitration agreement. I'll just cover like a few cases where the court has and what are the factors that have been taken into consideration by a Section 11 court for arriving at a decision as to whether an arbitrator should be appointed. Just a moment. Atmaja, I think you will be covering the existence of arbitration agreement, right? Atmaja?
I can't see the slide. I'm so sorry, I can't see your presentation for some reason. But I have a copy, so I'll just begin. The first factor, and in fact the most important, the only factor which the court has to see is whether there is an arbitration agreement in existence, and accordingly it has to appoint the arbitrator based upon the number of arbitrators required in the agreement. Now, Section 11(6)(a), as pointed out by Shilpa, was inserted by 2015 amendment, and it clearly limits the scope of the court, of a Section 11 court, to adjudicating upon this clause whether there is an existence of arbitration agreement. Now, the first case after the amendment came into place, which really propounded and finalized the position on what is the scope of a Section 11 court, is the case of Dura Felguera, where the court clearly stated that existence of an arbitration agreement is not same as adjudicating upon validity of the arbitration agreement. There are various decisions of High Courts, Delhi High Court and Bombay High Court, and I think the latest decision of Bombay High Court of 2019 clearly states that raising an issue with respect to validity of an arbitration agreement cannot be allowed in a Section 11 petition, because that in effect would be to the final impact would be to weed out the entire scope of arbitration, basically to nullify the arbitration right even before it actually begins and goes to the tribunal. Now, what exactly will be constituted or will be considered as existence of arbitration agreement? For that, you need to refer to Section 7 and the essentials of arbitration agreement, which will be explained by Shilpa.
So I'll just reproduce the Section 7 on the screen just for a moment. All right, so Section 7 defines what an arbitration agreement is, and it defines it to mean an agreement by the parties to submit to arbitration all or certain disputes which have arisen or which may arise between them in respect of a defined legal relationship, whether contractual or not. So because of this, it is essential, and this will fall into our explanation of what arbitrability of disputes means, because it's essential that the parties, when they agree to submit to arbitration, the ambit of the clause should be wide enough to cover the dispute that is being attempted to be arbitrated or submitted to arbitration. In the event of narrowly worded arbitration clauses, Section 7 is often employed to exclude that particular dispute from adjudication by filing an application under Section 16. Subsection 2 to Section 7 states that an arbitration agreement may be in the form of an arbitration clause in a contract or in the form of a separate agreement. And subsection 3 mandates that an arbitration agreement shall be in writing. What is interesting is that the ambit of an arbitration agreement has been very widely defined in Section 7. If you can see, it includes letters, telex, telegrams. It actually includes even communications exchanged through electronic means within its ambit. This is very helpful because there have been a number of judicial decisions which have held arbitration clauses which are exchanged over emails to also constitute a valid arbitration agreement in writing between the parties, and have held the parties bound to such an arbitration agreement. One such case was the case of Trimax International in 2010, where a formal contract was exchanged between the parties over email and neither of the parties had signed it. And later on, the parties had acted on the draft clauses of such a contract. Because the emails that were exchanged between the parties seemed to show a consensus on the language of the arbitration clause. And because of, by virtue of Section 7(4)(b), parties were held to be bound by this arbitration clause. They have actually, by virtue of the arbitration, by virtue of the wide definition of an arbitration agreement under Section 7, there have in fact been judgments where agreements which are not signed by either one party or in fact by both, agreements which are sent across by fax, agreements which are just included in email communications, telex, or any sort of a electronic mechanism have been held to be binding on parties. What the court will just see is that there was a consensus between both the parties, and that both the parties had agreed to be bound by this arbitration agreement. How the agreement is reproduced between both the parties is not necessarily a written agreement that's signed by both parties. Another interesting aspect of agreements that has been considered by courts is whether an arbitration agreement has to be stamped. This was settled by the Supreme Court in the recent decision in Garvare Wall Ropes versus Coastal Marine Construction. So what the Supreme Court over there analyzed is whether a question of stamp duty goes to the existence of an arbitration agreement, or whether it is something that goes to the validity of an arbitration agreement. And what the Supreme Court opined is that the purpose of a Stamp Act is to ensure that the public exchequer receives the amount due to it, and that parties do not unlawfully deprive the exchequer of statutory dues rightfully arising under an enactment, which is why an arbitration agreement and the question of inadequate stamping or lack of stamping of an arbitration agreement will go to the very root of existence of arbitration agreement, and will therefore not, such an arbitration agreement cannot therefore be proceeded with for appointment of arbitrator unless and until this document is impounded and proper stamp duties are fixed on it. Because till such time that a proper stamp duty is affixed on such an agreement, this agreement is not truly in existence. That is what the Supreme Court opined in Garvare. Atmaja, I think. Wait. Yes. So I think the next.
Shiva, I'm just adding in there. So while we're talking about what court needs to consider, which is obviously existence of arbitration agreement, it's also incumbent upon parties to see, and especially respondents to see, whether there exists the arbitration agreement and what is the correct forum or the phase where you can raise this question or this defense. Ideally, if you are questioning on existence of arbitration agreement in terms of whether there's a stamping, whether the parties have signed the agreements or not, whether there's actual exchange of arbitration clause or not, all of this should be raised before a Section 11 court and not under Section 16 before a tribunal.
In the event a Section 11 application is decided ex parte, then probably this will be something that will then finally be dealt with by your court, Section 34 court, because it is a question of existence of arbitration agreement. There is no power available with a arbitrary tribunal to deal with such a question under Section 16. You can raise it, but there are doubts about whether an arbitrator is even in fact empowered to deal with question of whether an arbitration agreement exists, and to question the judgment of the court which appointed him. Next, we'll just cover what happens in case there are serious questions of fraud that are raised. For the longest time, the position that was settled under Indian law is that questions of fraud are not arbitrable. The reason being that questions related... Actually, before going to this, what is interesting to note is that the definition of arbitrability is not found anywhere in the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. Even under the 1940 Act, and despite the frequent amendments in 2015 and 19, we've in fact never had a definition of arbitrability. Because of this, it's always the courts which have determined what would amount to arbitrability of a dispute. So because of that, the question of fraud has jumped around like a volleyball basis what the Supreme Court has decided from time to time. And up until recently, there was a lack of clarity on whether a issue of fraud will be arbitrable. The most the judgment that was most prevalent on this point was the judgment of the division bench of the Supreme Court, which was the judgment in N. Radhakrishnan, passed in 2009. This judgment declared that all disputes which involved any allegation of fraud will not be arbitrable. The idea was that usually questions of fraud involve complicated factual questions on which evidence usually has to be led, and which has to necessarily be decided in open court. And these matters affect the public at large, so they cannot be referred to a private tribunal to be decided. However, this position was modified by the judgment in Ayaswamy in 2016. What the court in Ayaswamy held is that there has to be a distinction drawn between fraud simpliciter and complex fraud, which is basically saying that simple allegations of fraud can be arbitrated and serious or complex fraud cannot be arbitrated. How do you determine what is serious fraud and what is complex fraud was something that the Supreme Court has recently delved into in Rashid Raza versus Sadaf Akhtar, which is a decision passed in 2019. What the Supreme Court has done is it has set out a twofold test for determining what amounts to a complex fraud. The first thing is whether the plea of fraud permeates through the entire contract and through the arbitration agreement itself, rendering it void. I'll just give an example here. If one party alleges that the arbitration agreement itself or the document in which it is contained was obtained by forgery, that permeates to the very existence of the arbitration agreement, and a question like that has to necessarily be decided by the court in open court and cannot be referred to an arbitral tribunal. The second is whether the allegations of fraud touch upon the internal affairs of the party inter se and have no implication in the public domain. So an example of this would be if there are allegations of siphoning of funds of a partnership or a company that is just affecting the relationship of the parties inter se and does not actually have any wider implications on the public and does not go to the root of the arbitration agreement, and hence this can easily be referred, it's not a serious allegation of fraud, it can easily be referred to an arbitral tribunal for decision. What the Supreme Court actually highlighted and stressed is that you cannot allow a person to escape adjudication under the Arbitration Act just by raising a mere bluster and a scam plea of fraud, and the court should examine it to see whether there is any substance in the allegation of fraud that is raised. Another question that was recently considered by the Supreme Court was whether the existence of dispute under the arbitration agreement is something that the court can go into, and this was decided against the proposition because the Supreme Court was of the view that only existence of the arbitration agreement is something that the court can go into. By this judgment, the Supreme Court has clarified the position earlier held in the case of United Insurance, where there was a confusion raised despite the existence of 11(6)(a). The Supreme Court had held that there can be some questions of the existence of dispute that can be gone into, but recently that has been clarified, and the Supreme Court has held that no, only existence of arbitration contract can be considered and not the existence or the validity of any dispute that may be arising under such a contract. The Supreme Court has also held that any questions of limitation cannot be dealt with by a Section 11 court. So this is something that is a jurisdiction objection, which is a well-settled position in Indian law, that questions regarding limitation are jurisdictional objections, which have to be decided on the basis of appreciation of facts as well as law. Considering that the jurisdiction of a Section 11 court is limited and is only limited to the existence of an arbitration agreement, hence questions of limitation are something which are beyond the jurisdiction of a Section 11 court and will have to be raised before an arbitrator. Just because we're on the point of limitation, the limitation for filing a Section 11 petition is usually 3 years from the date of the cause of action arising, and the cause of action arises 30 days after sending your notice under Section 21. It's interesting because recently the Delhi High Court has considered the question of whether you can reset the limitation period by sending a fresh notice of arbitration after a few months. And the Delhi High Court has held that that is not the case. Your first notice of arbitration will be the one that is relevant for determining when the limitation period commences, and any subsequent notices that are sent are not relevant for and will not extend the limitation period. Atmanjit, do you want to jump in here?
No, I think you've covered. Should I move to the last point?
Yeah.
So finally, like after the court, Section 11 court has appreciated all of these facts, it will go on to who has to be appointed as the arbitrator. For that, the most important factor to be considered is what is the wording of the arbitration agreement, whether there's a need for or does the agreement encapsulate any sort of qualification that has to be kept in mind while appointing the arbitrator. And while the court appoints the arbitrator, it seeks a disclosure or a declaration from the arbitrator who will be appointed in the matter under Section 11, subclause 8. The basic purpose of the disclosure is twofold. First, that the arbitrator must disclose and declare that he or she has the qualifications as required under the agreement. And second is that he will be impartial and will be independent to the proceedings, and that he has no connection with either of the parties or the any sort of distant link with the parties involved in the proceeding. Now, when the court sees this declaration, it relies upon 3 schedules: Schedule 5, 6 and 7. Now, Schedule 6 is the form of declaration in which the arbitrator or the proposed arbitrator will give such declaration. Schedule 5 and 7 are crucial because they give out factors which will be considered and which may also form crucial to challenge the appointment of an arbitrator later under Section 12. Now, what Schedule 5 talks about is basically grounds that will give rise to doubt with respect to independence or impartiality of an arbitrator. And when such a factor is raised, whether on grounds of Section 12 challenge or at the time when the court is appointing the arbitrator, it will ensure that the arbitrator does not have any sort of personal or professional link with the parties concerned. There is no legal advice rendered, or it has to see that the arbitrator was not involved in the subject matter of dispute at any point in time. The arbitrator would also see whether there's any indirect interest concerned with the companies or with the entities involved in the dispute. For example, if the arbitrator is a shareholder in a company which is involved in the dispute, then that may be a ground which can be raised because the arbitrator has an indirect sort of interest in the dispute, and if the subject matter of dispute is revolving around that. So after the declaration is received from the arbitrator and the court has basically checklisted the factors given in Schedule 5 and 7, the arbitrator is finally appointed who will begin the process of arbitration. Should we proceed to the next slide? Okay. So whatever learning we've done in the past, say 2 hours, it's all sort of unlearning because 2019 amendment has brought so many changes that the entire gamut of what Section 11 has been used until now will going forward change because of the fact that it brings in the mechanism of arbitral institutions, which will be the whole and sole authority for appointing arbitrators, for creating rules, procedures, and creating a repository of all awards that are rendered by the institutes in India. Now, we will be touching briefly on what the amendment seeks to do and how it will impact the Section 11 proceedings. We are not expanding the scope of the delineation on the amendments. Now, basically, the amendment brings in change.
One second.
Yes, yes.
How long do you think that this is likely to take, and how many more slides do you have?
We have one slide on this, and then we'll be proceeding to the jurisdiction challenge, Section 16. So
my suggestion is that we close for the day, because I would like it if you, because once you do start the 2019 amendment aspect, there may be certain questions specifically on the operation of the institution and how certain aspects are likely to be dealt with. So let's take up this and the Section 16 challenge tomorrow.
Sure.
All right.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll continue the series tomorrow and look forward to hosting you back again. Thanks, Atmaja and Shilpa.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Shilpa.
Thank you.